I wanted to mention that this is not an exhaustive look at the bill. We have focused specifically on over-the-top broadcasting services and the provisions that pertain to them. Throughout the call, I will speak about over-the-top broadcasting services and streaming services interchangeably because they both pretty much mean the same thing. So, yeah, two major questions that we need to address. What is broadcasting and why do we need a broadcasting law that regulates streaming services? I'll leave the second one to Nikhil first and then get back to you on what broadcasting is under the bill.
Yeah, so the reason why we are seeing a demand for, or we're seeing the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and this is my take on it, looking at regulation of online streaming through a broadcast law. I feel that there are two triggers for this. Number one, there was we know that the IT rules essentially are not backed by law, as in they create a definition of online curated content providers, etc., etc. And somewhere, uh, just like the IT rules are being challenged by news organizations because there's an entirely new definition of online news that is created and online news aggregators that is created. Um, there is also a risk of without a regulatory backing, without a legal backing, that some streaming service might go to court. Obviously, they aren't doing that. They haven't done that. Um, but it still needs legal backing. So you have a broadcast law essentially because you need to legitimize rules which are essentially illegal. The second thing is that MIB was blindsided when this regulation on smoking warnings came in from the Ministry of Health. And while the Ministry of Health is saying that it has the legislative sort of power it has the power through its own regulations to create rules for online streaming services. I think MeitY at some shape or form wants to become the sole regulatory entity or government entity that regulates streaming services, and for all regulations to go through MIB. Sorry, not MeitY, but MIB. So my sense is that it's an indication of that health guidelines that came out about smoking that also triggered the need for a separate bill for regulating online streaming. Then, okay, I'll hand it over to Kamya, but there's something I want to talk about definitions as well. I'll get to that later. Kamya?
Okay, so coming back to definitions, this is how broadcasting has been defined. I would like to focus on the one-to-many transmission aspect. And there's two kinds of major broadcasting service providers that have been talked about. There's broadcasters and broadcast network operators. Now, the reason I bring this up is because both these definitions, as you can see, include OTT service providers, so streaming service providers. Yeah, so both of them are included. And that's why the provisions that we're going to discuss will be referring to both of these types of operators. I'd like Nikhil to come back in here because he had to take about why this is an issue, why including OTT and the broadcasting would be an issue.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things to consider when you look at online streaming services. I don't like the phrase OTT, but essentially, first aspect is that online streaming is personal viewing. It's on a personal device. It could be on a shared screen within the family, but essentially, broadly, it is on a personal device. Most of India's internet connections are mobile by design, right? So, um, uh, you therefore it's not necessarily communication to the public, and so how a one-to-one distribution of information of content can be treated as public viewing and therefore come under this definition of broadcast is not clear. It's something that should be challenged. The second is that all of the content that we view on broadcast is essentially pull. You choose what you want to watch. And so it is private viewing, it is on-demand viewing. And if you go back to the Kamlesh Vaswani versus Union of India case back in the day, I think in 2017 or 18, 2018 or 19, actually, it was that I was in Supreme Court, court number one, and uh, in that case, and very clearly, uh, the Indian government said through the Attorney General of India that uh, they don't want to get into anyone's bedroom and see what they're viewing privately. They don't want to regulate porn, basically. And that was a case about regulation of porn. They said they don't want to do model policing, they don't want to uh, regulate private viewing. And so, structurally, if you take the content out of the mix from a distribution perspective, from a consumption perspective, there is no functional difference between porn and streaming services. They're all private viewing. They are all essentially unicast. It's not broadcast. So if that's what the government has said in court, I don't understand how you can come out with a bill that regulates exactly that. And the same way, the IT rules shouldn't be valid for the same reason. Of course, the streaming services industry likes this regulation. Uh, they like being regulated because it essentially reduces the kind of grievances that they get. Like now, users have to go through a grievance redressal mechanism instead of earlier. What was happening was where busybodies were going to court straight away. Now the court can ask them, "Did you file a grievance? Did you get a response?" etc., etc. Right? So it reduces the burden of going to court for streaming services. But with even with that relaxation, there are other issues that pop up, which is censorship and regulation of speech on and restriction of creativity, um, restriction of challenging content. Kamya?
Yeah. Moving on from this, this is essentially a table that tells us who can and cannot provide broadcasting services in India. So, government bodies are not allowed to provide broadcasting services. However, state governments, local governance bodies, and a bunch of other organizations are allowed to do so, provided by the central government if they meet certain terms and conditions and for the fulfillment of social objectives. Political parties are not allowed to provide broadcasting services. However, both of these are allowed to provide OTT broadcasting services. Now, the question that comes up here is if political parties are not allowed to provide broadcasting services for to prevent, let's say, propaganda, how would OTT broadcasting be any different? That could just as well lead to the proliferation of propaganda, specifically because OTT services are becoming fairly popular recently. Yeah, with all this talk about OTT broadcasting services or streaming services, it makes sense to understand how this has been defined under the bill as well. So this is what the definition says. These are services that provide content on demand or live to subscribers, have a curated catalog of programs, and require additional hardware or software in case of non-smart televisions or devices. So this is a point that I would like you to keep in mind for future reference. All the provisions that we're going to be discussing for streaming services only apply to them, and they're the ones who may have to ensure compliance to them. Network operators and internet service providers, essentially telecom companies, will not be responsible for ensuring compliance. So who isn't included under OTT broadcasting services? Social media intermediaries as defined under the ID Act aren't included. These are service providers that allow people to communicate between each other and allow the average user to post content. Also, entities that the government decides can also be excluded from the scope of the bill. The question here is, how will YouTube channels and political parties be impacted by the bill? So, social media intermediaries are not included, but a platform like YouTube allows people to, conduct streams and also has this specific section of on-demand content called YouTube Red, which, although not available in India, could potentially be in the future, or services like that could very well exist. So the question that comes here is, how are such services going to be treated under the bill?
Yeah, so if you look at it, this bill makes no mention of uh, whether it's video or not. From what I can gather, it is. So is music streaming also covered as broadcast, right? Uh, is podcasting covered as broadcast as non-fiction content? Remember, there was an entire show called Serial, I think it was. No, a few years ago that became the rage on podcasting, where an entire story was they went to an entire story um, episode by episode. Uh, so it's not clear whether the music streaming or podcasting, which is audio only, is covered. Um, the other is the question about if streaming services add content, but can they be exempt from the bill? One of the things we have to keep in mind is that um, just because they're adding content doesn't make them a social media intermediary. In fact, it might make them a social media intermediary, but the regulation of 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 publishing is going to be separate from the regulation of commenting, because safe harbor protections for intermediaries are under a are functional in nature. It's not an organization that is treated as an intermediary. So far under the IT Act, we don't know what will happen with the Digital India Act, but it's a functional restriction or it's a functional regulation. So MediaNama, for example, is a publishing platform for the purpose of publishing and is an intermediary for the publishing of you adding comments to it. So even if you add comments, it doesn't exempt you from being treated as a streaming service. Um, in terms of YouTube and Instagram, those are very clearly user-generated content platforms. They are publishing, um, you know, users are publishing content on the platforms, and therefore, social media intermediaries are exempt from a classification as broadcast as broadcasting service providers. What I'm not very clear on, and maybe Kamya, you can talk about this. Would they be treated as broadcast network operators because they're allowing others to broadcast content?
It's not very clear in the bill, in all honesty. So we don't know for sure. Of course, there's going to be comments to this bill, so that might shed clarity, and there's going to be changes if this is just a draft. So
Yeah.
there might be more
Okay.
clarity then.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. Here are the compliance requirements for OTT platforms. So first and foremost, streaming services have to meet a certain threshold of subscribers and viewers, and once they do so, they have to inform the government that they are providing streaming services. So they have to do this either within 1 month of the bill being notified or within 1 month of hitting the subscriber/viewer threshold, which will be prescribed by the government at a later date. And in the interest of in the interest of helping OTT providers who don't meet these criteria, the government can relax the provisions for for providers that don't meet the threshold of subscribers and viewers. Now, post this comes the program and advertising code. These codes will be prescribed by the government at a later date. While we don't know what's in the codes, we do know what can happen in case of non-compliance. So these are all the ideas that I mentioned in that the government can ask you to do this. I know it says they can ask you to direct a channel to be put off air, but channels are also a part of some OTT providers such as Hotstar. So I think this would apply to them as well. Uh, then comes fines for non-compliance. The interesting thing here is that there's no jail time for not complying with the program code and the advertising code. Also, um other service providers, such as let's say television channels and radio stations, they have to obtain a registration from the government to update to provide their services. However, the same is not true for OTT providers. This is also at play here because if other providers don't comply with the terms of the program and advertising codes, they'll have to forego their registration. However, the same cannot be done for OTT service providers. The government can also issue guidelines for streaming services to classify their programs based on the following criterion. This classification has to be displayed prominently at the beginning of a program. Age ratings have to be created based on it, and the government can create access control measures. So essentially, if a program has been classified to be suitable only for those above the age of 13, then the OTT provider has to ensure that nobody can access the program. Then come in the accessibility guidelines. These will be issued by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. These are some examples that were mentioned in the bill. Of course, they could probably add more. So uh, providers can be asked to add subtitles. They can be asked to add audio descriptions, sign language, and ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. Then there's fines for non-compliance, and moving on to regulatory structures. So the first one, which is probably the most important and the one that we should discuss in much detail, is the content evaluation committees. These have to be formed by the providers themselves, the streaming services themselves. They are made up of a group of different social groups, so women, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and a bunch of the things under this committee have to be prescribed by the government. So number of members in the CEC, minimum members required for every meeting. And I think the most important one, other details required for the smooth functioning. This probably gives the government a lot of leeway on how they can, control how the CEC is formed. The government can also prescribe certain programs that don't need a CEC certification, and can also detail how the certificate by a CEC must be displayed and what it must contain.
Just before we move on from this, one thing to remember is that most broadcasting entities already have something of an internal mechanism for evaluation of content. A lot of this content basically goes through uh, a legal team, and when we've held discussions in Delhi on regulation of content, and especially with respect to streaming services, and I remember, and that was off the record, so I won't repeat the example. Uh, but Gosimran Khamba of AIB, who was at that point in time creating a series with Irfan Pathan, basically, sorry, not Irfan Pathan, with Irfan Khan, basically said that uh, there was a particular scene that the lawyers asked to be removed, um, just because of the presence of a national symbol in that scene, and because the person who was speaking on camera was saying something that was abusive, but not to the nation or to the symbol, right? So uh, there is a significant amount of legal scrutiny that already happens with content in streaming services, and if you haven't yet read it, do read the Washington Post story recently, I mean, just yesterday, about censorship of online content that is already taking place. Now, if every entity is going to be required to create a content evaluation committee within their organization, and then all of them are going to be required to uh, assess each show, film, um, and then if there are multiple languages, will they then be required to have the same set of characters evaluating it in a different language because the dialogues might change with translation or something might be added or removed? Um, how does this work at scale is a question, right? Because streaming services have multiple languages, um, uh, and many of the new shows are being created in multiple languages because they become accessible to a larger audience with dubbing. So will you have content evaluation committees for in, let's say, 20 languages? And how will that impact cost of production is another thing to consider. So at scale, at global scale, this becomes unviable. Kamya?
Yeah. Moving on from this, there's three regulatory systems that are in place for grievance redressal under this bill. There's self-regulation by broadcasters, self-regulatory organizations, and a broadcast advisory council. Self-regulation by broadcasters is essentially the appointment of grievance redressal officers, creation of mechanisms for filing complaints, and publishing the redressal mechanism, related information related to the mechanism. These are the fines in place for non-compliance and not having a grievance redressal officer. Then there's the self-regulatory organizations. These are made up of broadcasters. They address complaints that were not addressed by the grievance redressal officer, issue guidance for compliance, and create governing norms for consistent with the bill. This is what happens in case you don't comply with the self-regulatory organization. And then there's
So there's one interesting thing, and if you could just move to the next slide, Kamya. There's also a government broadcast advisory council. Now, if you look at the way at least the bill treats with these, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kamya, the way the bill treats this, it seems like a hierarchical structure. Um, but if you look at the IT rules, and this is clarified by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in multiple calls that happened thereafter, the current structure under the IT rules, and like I said, if you look at the structure, it's very similar to the existing structure that exists for OTT streaming services, where you have self-regulation by the organization, then you have a self-regulatory organization, and then you have a government committee. Now, this is in contrast to that. It will probably replace that system. But what the ministry had said then was it's not a hierarchical structure, which is that they said anyone can complain straight to the government as well. And then they assured the industry that they will send the complaint down directly to either the SRO or to the streaming service. In this case, there is a hierarchy. So it means by the looks of it, it means that a user must demonstrate that they've appealed to various levels before it comes to the government. I wonder if this also means that there are many complaints that are going directly to a government committee, but I'm not sure if a government committee has even been formed over there. I guess that's something we need to figure out.
Yeah, that is how the bill talks about it. So the complainant, the person who has issues with a streaming service, first complains to the streaming service. If there's a problem isn't solved, then they move on and on. That's how it goes.
Yeah, so it's different from the existing structure where you can go to any level at any point in time. And they usually direct you to the level below, but you can still appeal to you can go to any level first.
This is just my interpretation based on the current version. Of course, this could change because this is just the first draft.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a broadcast advisory council. So again, it hears complaints that were not addressed by the self-regulatory body, and it also addresses complaints that are referred to it by the central government. So here, I think it probably implies that the government does get complaints too, because of course that's how they're going to refer it to the Broadcast Advisory Council. Then this is the structure of the organization, largely made up of government representatives. Even members were nominated by the government. Co-opted members also can only vote in meetings of the Broadcast Advisory Council if they are chosen based on government approval. Then there's a bunch of things under the Broadcast Advisory Council that are yet to be prescribed. All of this is included there. And then there's the major question of news and news, current affairs, and documentaries. So any person, and I'd like you to focus on the word person here, broadcasting news through an online paper, through a news portal, website, social media intermediary, or any other medium will have to comply with the program and advertising code. So this means that if a person like, let's say you or me, reads a news story, thinks it's interesting, has something to say about it, puts out a tweet about it, we would also have to comply with the provisions of the bill. At least that's how I read it.
But then so won't the threshold apply to an individual as well? Because if let's say I have on Twitter, say some 56,000 followers, and let's say there is a minimum requirement of 100,000 followers, right? So it will not apply to me, right? Even if I'm tweeting the news.
No, so the thing about thresholds is that let's say you have 50,000 followers and the threshold is 1 lakh. You have to inform the government when you reach that threshold. That doesn't mean that the provisions of the bill don't apply to you, at least currently. The bill only says that the government can relax the provisions for those who don't meet the threshold, but at least in the current version, nothing like that has happened. it entirely depends on what the government does in the future.
So let's say someone has a YouTube channel and they are, say, they have, let's say, 1 million followers. They could, these guidelines of OT applicable to streaming services will be applicable to them if, let's say, they meet a threshold by the government. And so they
Yeah.
will have to, so if all the provisions are applicable, will those that run news channels also have to have a content evaluation committee?
Those things are unclear because it isn't spoken about directly in the bill. But given the fact that it says that all the provisions for OTT service providers are applicable to them with necessary alterations, or we don't know what these alterations will be, that does tell us that the CEC and everything else that we've spoken about so far will be applicable to them as well. Even everything we'll speak about from post this.
So,
Uh,
so, so this looks like an oversight because they have in definitions tweaked it so that it's applicable to persons, um, and they've created the thresholds uh, for informing the government, but the applicability is to everyone. So it looks like more of an oversight.
could potentially be. Who this doesn't apply to, though, is publishers of newspapers. So let's say the Times of India has a newspaper and they publish an e-paper of the same. So they won't have to comply with the provisions of this bill. Again, these are questions which Nikhil has already mostly raised. Um, the question that we haven't discussed yet is the question of documentaries. So let's say we talk about a documentary that's been made on current affairs, about the violence in Gaza, about the situation there.
Right.
So
So I'll take these. So I mean, I've mentioned some of these things already. So a content evaluation committee will logically apply to news and current affairs as well, because of the construct of this bill, although they might eventually be exempt if there is criticism of that approach. Second is that there are self-regulatory structures that are already in place. They will probably have to modify their approach, and there might be an amendment to the IT rules following the passing of this bill if it passes in its current form. Um, so the IT rules will probably have to be amended. Um, Kamya, do you want to talk about what this has over and above the IT rules?
it doesn't have too much, in the sense that the only major difference I noticed was that the self-regulatory organizations will be formed only by broadcasters, unlike the IT rules, where a member of the a retired judge of the Supreme Court or the High Court can be asked to head that organization. Nothing like that has been mentioned here.
So,
Other
okay,
than that, it reads the same.
so the structure is going to change probably because of that. Um, Now, on the documentary front, I mean, what we've seen is, for example, with the Indian government's ban uh, uh, on the documentary by the BBC that was critical of the Prime Minister, there is that kind of a situation where it's being released will probably not happen at all in India because there will be a content evaluation committee that will look into sensitivities and essentially prevent the release of documentaries for the most bit. You might also see the same thing. And it's one other thing which is not clear is, will documentaries be treated as news and current affairs? And so as content, will that be regulated um, as news and current affairs, or will it be uh, treated as entertainment content? So like there is going to be a committee looking, and documentaries by their design uh, are about important events that have impacted people and people's lives and often involve crimes. And if you look at how insipid, some channels and shows that show documentaries on television became over a period of time because of perhaps concerns that were raised about the kind of content or the kind of documentaries that were being shown, um, you will probably not have edgy documentaries on streaming services anymore. Uh, and most likely, you won't have documentaries pertaining to India. because there would be greater risks attached to documentaries as compared to entertainment content. Um, Again, I'm not sure whether documentaries on current affairs will have to meet the requirements for news content here. But remember that users are regulated differently uh, as I mean, on a social media platform as news and current affairs users, and on streaming services, those are obviously licensed content, so it will be subject to a CEC.
Yeah. Moving on to this. What are the regulatory powers held by the government? First thing here is lawful interception. So here I would like you to bring in some context from the consultation done by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, which was on the regulation of OTT communication services. Now, OTT communication services mean things like WhatsApp and Telegram. Responses to that consultation had talked about lawful interception of communication services. So, telecom companies had essentially argued that communication services should be subject to lawful interception regulation, the same way that telecom companies are. With the fact that this provision has been mentioned under this bill, I believe that that argument would simply gain more validity because it's actually been mentioned in a bill now. Then selective banning is also a provision that was mentioned during the TRI consultation. Selective banning was something that was a part of that consultation quite heavily. So, and this is where I would like to bring in the point that I'd mentioned earlier in the presentation about the fact that telecom companies will not be responsible for ensuring that the provisions of this bill are complied to. So this means that OTT services will have to ensure that they're conducting selective bans by themselves. So responses to the TRI consultation had mentioned that to conduct a selective ban, an OTT platform or a streaming platform in this case would have to know the location of their users. They would essentially have to track the location, which would be a privacy violation.
So in this, I'm not sure what lawful interception, to be honest, Kamya, even means here. Does it mean the lawful interception of someone who's publishing content on a streaming service? But streaming service is not, I mean, YouTube is not covered under this regulation in any case. So I don't understand what lawful interception means in that context. The other is when it comes to selective banning, this will probably have to be done via telecom operators. So telecom operators might be exempt from the provisions of the bill for the when it comes to the fact that content is being streamed via telecom operators to a user. But I think the bans will only have to be executed by them. I don't think it's possible to execute a ban on any service without the involvement of telecom operators uh, anywhere in the world right now.
Telecom operators actually made some very interesting points about why it's difficult to execute a selective ban by them. They said that to do so, they would need the IP addresses of all websites. And, how would you possibly have a list of all websites and all platforms? So there could be some that you would end up missing. Also, there's the issue of dynamic IP addresses of the use of virtual private networks, which would make it hard to implement something like this.
It's
And
hard, but then it doesn't mean that bans haven't been executed in India.
True, but the difficulty mentioned there would be just as applicable in this case as well. It's important to note here that there are 65 instances where rules or provisions will be prescribed by the government later. This is in contrast to the data protection bill, which was released, not the bill, the act now, which was notified fairly recently, which only had 27 instances where rules will be prescribed later.
Yeah, but it's still large. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is that, and I mentioned this in the context of the data protection bill as well, and on that call, we'll expect this in the Digital India Act as well. The government is giving itself powers to make more rules because it allows them flexibility in making regulations. It takes years to pass a bill in Parliament, and it can take a few days or a few weeks to basically create a new regulation. And that's why with the IT rules, we've seen uh, new rules being created uh, every 6 months, 8 months. I think there have been 5 instances where rules have been created. I don't know if in the next couple of months we'll get another set of rules on specifically looking at deepfakes. So government wants that flexibility to be responsive to an environment. So that's why it's probably giving itself rule-making powers, because then it can amend rules more easily in those 65 instances instead of having things hard-coded into a law. And we will see this in tech regulation going forward with every law that comes up. There will be more regulations, there will be more consultations, there will be more rule making that happens. There'll be less lawmaking and more rule making going forward. Kamya?
Another part that I think is important to mention is that, and this is specifically in the context of censorship, which we've talked about quite extensively, is prohibiting the relay of a program. So the government can, in the following interest, prohibit relay of certain programs and films and so on. So going back to the Gaza example that I wanted to talk about earlier, let's say there's a documentary about it, and the government doesn't agree with the stance that the documentary takes. It could censor that content in the interest of the friendly relations with the foreign state. So content doesn't necessarily have to do with India to get censored. If it doesn't align with what the state wants to say, then it can still get
These
censored.
are these are all most of them are in line with the restrictions on fundamental rights under 19.2. So I don't think this is any surprise, to be honest.
Then consequences for non-compliance. So the one I would like to specifically mention here is penalties. We've discussed penalties throughout the presentation, but the scale of penalties varies depending on the size of the organization, and they go as follows. Then there's the applicability of the bill to emerging technologies. Now, the thing about emerging technologies is that the bill doesn't define what these are. And we've seen this happen not just in the case of this bill, but also in the case of a TRI consultation, which was also done on emerging technologies. That term hasn't been defined anywhere. Uh, in this bill, these technologies will be ones that meet the following criteria. So, I mean, I am led to believe that this bill could potentially eventually extend to services like augmented reality and virtual reality, because again, they could provide a service similar to broadcasting services as well. So you could all have the same experience inside an AR world or something. Yeah. And that's about it.
Okay.
Rooms open for questions.
Thanks, Kamya. You can remove the slideshow now. We'll Rakesh, we can stop recording.